Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking some seriously deep political economy research to reveal how governing systems are mechanically designed for highly specific outcomes. We usually think of governance in these highly emotional or ideological terms, right? But today, we're popping the hood to look at the actual nuts and bolts. And we're going to start with the very concept of democracy itself. So let's dive right in by challenging a pretty romanticized legend. We're almost always taught to view democracy as this magical moral cure-all, like it's just a natural state of civic virtue. But the research suggests something completely different. It actually posits that democratic performance isn't some moral constant. Instead, it's a highly intentional mechanical system of design choices. Simply put, the rules of the game absolutely dictate the outcome of the game. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at democracy as a design problem. Second, America's managed republic. Third, the mechanics of elite control. Fourth, rebuilding a broken state. Fifth, the 20-year transition roadmap. And finally, designing for genuine inclusion. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Democracy as a Design Problem. When we think about exactly how we should analytically view these complex political systems, there's a massive contrast between the idealized legend we're taught and the mechanical reality. The legend tells us that salvation comes through the ballot box, but the reality, the actual design problem, asks a much tougher question. Who exactly sets the administrative rules? Who decides how information gets distributed and how our preferences are aggregated? The research points out the voter participation is incredibly elastic to the rules chosen by whoever happens to be in power. So seemingly neutral things like ID standards or how precincts are allocated, they act as very predictable filters. Which brings us to Section 2, America's Managed Republic. To see this design problem play out in real life, the source material points us directly to the foundational blueprint of the United States. James Madison famously wrote that the goal was to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. That's a pretty striking quote, isn't it? The research highlights that the U.S. was originally engineered not as a pure democracy, but rather as a managed republic. It was built with highly intentional mechanisms, think the Electoral College or the Three-Fifths Compromise, that were specifically designed to ensure elite continuity and protect property from majoritarian pressures. And you know what? That original design has incredible momentum even today. That elite continuity is anchored by a staggering modern pay gap. The CEO to typical worker pay ratio currently sits at a massive 290 to 1. When you combine that number with the fact that roughly 60% of Americans report living paycheck to paycheck, you're looking at a systemic outcome that was quite literally hardwired into the constitutional architecture from day one. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that a managed republic predictably yields extreme wealth concentration. When we look at the numbers, the top 1% holds 31% of the wealth, and the next 9% holds another 29%. If you do the math, that means the top 10% controls a whopping 60% of all wealth. That's an economic reality entirely insulated from our everyday electoral rituals. The system essentially manages the public while the wealth stays highly concentrated. Let's move on to Section 3, the mechanics of elite control. You might be wondering, how exactly does this system sustain itself today, especially since we now have universal suffrage? Well, the research identifies a very specific architecture of control. It's basically an illusion of choice maintained by a political duopoly using several interconnecting tools. They use campaign finance laws to legally convert money into access. They rely on concentrated media ownership to narrow the window of public debate. They even leverage the 13th Amendment's punishment clause to maintain a massive carceral labor system. And paradoxically, they use rules like granting unconditional voting rights to permanently non-resident citizens, which actually ends up diluting domestic accountability. And this domestic management, it demands a massive footprint abroad too. With around 750 global military bases scattered across roughly 80 countries, this system projects a foreign policy that's often wrapped up in highly moral language. But as the research notes, it is fundamentally rooted in realpolitik and access to resources. The empire abroad basically sustains the managed democracy back home. So, if we accept this premise that governance is purely mechanical, literally a machine built of laws, incentives, and rules, then it stands to reason that a broken machine can't be fixed with just better rhetoric, right? So how do you design a system completely from scratch to avoid these exact traps of elite capture? That brings us right to Section 4, rebuilding a broken state. Here, the research offers a truly
fascinating proposal for a transitioning state. It's a highly detailed blueprint for a post-autocratic Russia, based on what the author calls awareness economics. And the analytical argument here is just brilliant in its pragmatism. It argues that a newly reforming state shouldn't just isolate itself, but it also shouldn't just pick a superpower bloc to hide behind. Instead, it needs to practice managed interdependence. This means anchoring the country in absolute transparency, strictly adhering to international regulatory compliance, and utilizing multi-rail payment systems. The goal? To build resilient global sovereignty without ever becoming dependent on any single global hegemon.
Now, to actually pull this off, the research suggests that a transitioning state absolutely must sequence its reforms. The golden rule here is competence before charisma. You have to establish economic truth through total fiscal transparency first. Then you build out predictable administration using independent courts. Only after those two foundational pillars are established do you attempt full civic integration and political liberalization. If you try to legislate democracy before stabilizing the finances, you're just going to reproduce disorder. Okay, Section 5, the 20-year transition roadmap. So what does this sequenced fix actually look like over a realistic time horizon? The research maps out a meticulous 20-year timeline. In Phase 1, which is the first 2 years, you just stabilize. You publish a truth of accounts to stop the bleeding. In Phase 2, years 3 through 7, you repair institutions. You set up independent anti-corruption courts and implement civil service rotations to draw in capital. Phase 3, years 8 through 12, is your industrial renaissance, moving away from just extracting raw resources. And finally, in Phase 4, years 13 through 20, you embed genuine civic equity through participatory local budgets. But how do you pay for it? Well, this proposal shows exactly how a state can fund its own salvation. Instead of letting resource rents just enrich a narrow oligarchy, the plan requires reinvesting 30% of hydrocarbon money directly into a sovereign innovation fund. This money goes into building Siberian free zones for green tech and funding a massive federal polytechnic network. You are literally taking geological wealth from the ground and converting it directly into human capital wealth for the society. It's an absolute game changer. Finally, let's look at Section 6, Designing for Genuine Inclusion. Let's tie these global realities together to define the true principles of democratic inclusion. Because whether we're examining the historical continuities of the American system's managed republic or looking at this hypothetical blueprint for rebuilding Russia, the main takeaway is exactly the same. Transparency and deliberate institutional redesign are literally the only ways to shift power. You have to replace money as access with small donor matching. You absolutely must counter media monopolies with strict ownership transparency. And you have to replace any reliance on carceral labor with a universal social floor. The research wraps up with these highly actionable principles: open metrics, anti-monopoly enforcement, automatic voter registration, and a diplomacy-first strategy. These aren't just pie-in-the-sky ideals, guys. They are the required mechanical gears necessary for structural accountability. Without them, you don't have a working machine. You just have the illusion of one. I want to leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought about our global future. Sovereignty is no longer just about isolation or military might. It is a function of pure systemic competence. So, is the democratic machine you live in genuinely built for that survival, or is it just managing your expectations? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a powerful new lens to look at the mechanics of the world around us.